Any historian would tell you that ultimately one incident propelled America into World War I, the sinking of a British passenger ship called the Lusitania that also had 125 American passengers on board. After years of suspicion and controversy surrounding the incident, it seems to be confirmed that the ship was intentionally sent into dangerous waters as part of a plot to involve America into the Great War. On the center stage, the Allied forces are in purple. You always hear all wars are bankers' wars, and the World War I drama is an easy way to illustrate that. This is J.P. Morgan. He loaned about $1.5 billion to Britain and France in the form of purchasing bonds. That's the equivalent to over $45 billion today. With that new money in hand, the Allied forces turned around and used Morgan as a purchasing agent for war supplies in America. So Morgan collected interest on money loaned in the form of bonds, and then again from commission in war materials purchased. Because he owned powder and steel and other raw materials companies that were needed to make things like ammunition and other war supplies, he was profiting threefold. He was acting as a purchaser, as a purchasing agent to his own businesses on money that he had already loaned and was collecting interest on to Britain and France. One transaction listed over 4 million rifles, even though J.P. Morgan told the press that, and I quote, "Nobody could hate war more than I do." Woodrow Wilson had promised to keep America out of direct involvement in the war, and banking magnates like Morgan were happy cashing in, acting as lender and purchaser to the Allied forces. That is, until the war shifted in Germany's favor. German U-boats were so effective at taking out British food and supply ships that they are solely credited with turning the tide of the war. The stage was set and U.S. banking interests were threatened because those bonds purchased from Britain and France by Morgan were up for renewal. And after all, if Germany and the Axis forces were to prevail, there wouldn't be a British or a French government left to make good on the bonds owed to Morgan. President Wilson's advisor, Colonel House, not only was in Britain, but speaking directly to King George V about the prospect of what would happen in America if the Lusitania were to be sunk. And he's quoted as saying, "There was talk of the ship going down. Winston Churchill, who was at the time the First Lord of the Admiralty, did several things to encourage the process. In addition, Churchill also withdrew the Lusitania's escort, the Juno, which was supposed to intercept the Lusitania on its way to the British harbor and bring it back safely. Commander Kenworthy, who is said to have stormed out of the war room with Churchill, is quoted, "So, with U.S. investments in question, a British ship with 125 American passengers was being sent at reduced speed with her escort withdrawn into dangerous German U-boat waters." There is one more detail though. The alleged passenger ship was carrying over 4 million rounds of Remington 308 ammunition, making it a viable war target. Part of the American war propaganda depended on the story that Germany shot down innocent civilians, and this discovery effectively disproves that. The war propaganda and enlist posters were abundant, and it certainly wasn't hard to reach virtually every American citizen because, as luck would have it, J.P. Morgan also owned many of the newspapers. Representative Calloway of Texas summarizes it this way. Just 8 days after the official U.S. declaration of war, the Congress passed the Loan Liberty Bond Act, officially freeing up millions of dollars in foreign relief aid to the Allied forces. Since the Allied forces owed J.P. Morgan a substantial percentage of that money quite literally went directly into the pockets of J.P. Morgan. Even though the U.S. Congress did sell U.S. war bonds to drum up some additional funding, the lion's share came from the newly created Federal Reserve legal right to issue credit money in deposits in currency, adjusted deposits of all banks and currency and outside banks. This is banking and money statistics. It shows clearly that the money supply doubled between 1915 and 1920, meaning that new dollars were created by the Federal Reserve with this new influx of paper notes that had entered the marketplace. It's not hard to understand why the economic disparity and Great Depression were soon to follow. Years later, when the dust settled, Senator Gerald Nye would launch an investigation into how the war machine operates and who profits from it. As a summary, a passenger ship was loaded with arms and not disclosed to the public, was sent at reduced speed into German U-boat waters while conversations were being had with the US President's top advisor and King George V about the implications of what would happen if that ship went down. And meanwhile, after the ship does go down and the declaration of war, the legislation that is passed immediately profits the people that were most heavily invested into the war. There's two versions of history. One is accidental, and then the other is conspiratorial. And when you examine the facts and the sequence of events, I think the conspiratorial version makes much more sense.